They had no idea who was standing before them. One mistake, and their lives would change forever. When a wealthy businessman is thrown out of a luxury hotel because of the color of his skin, they don't realize that the next day they'll find themselves facing him in a very different position. Now, he makes the rules, and they will have to learn the real cost of their prejudice. If you want to find out how it all ends, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss this and other stories. James Hall stepped out of his car and took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze against his skin. He looked up at the grand facade of the luxury hotel, its pristine exterior gleaming under the midday sun. This was where his important business meeting was set to take place, a meeting that could change the course of his career. James, a successful black businessman, was no stranger to the elite circles, yet he was always aware of the scrutiny that followed him wherever he went. Today, however, he felt a particular sense of unease. As he walked into the hotel lobby, his sharp eyes quickly noticed the cold stares from the staff and guests. It wasn't the first time he had encountered such looks, but there was something about this place that felt different, an underlying hostility that permeated the air. He adjusted his tie, straightened his shoulders, and made his way to the front desk with a confident stride. The receptionist, a young woman with a polished smile, glanced up at him. Her expression shifted subtly as she took in his appearance. Her eyes lingered on him just a moment too long, revealing a hint of unease before she plastered on a forced smile. "Good afternoon. How may I help you?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral but edged with a distant formality. "Good afternoon," James replied, offering a polite nod. "I have a reservation under the name James Hall. I'm here for a business meeting." The receptionist's smile faltered slightly, and she quickly tapped on her keyboard, her eyes darting between the screen and James. He could sense her hesitation, and his instincts told him something was off. After a few moments, she looked up, still smiling, but there was a tightness around her eyes. "I'm sorry, sir, but it seems there might be a mistake," she said, her voice laced with doubt. "Are you sure you're at the right hotel?" James kept his expression calm, though he felt a familiar irritation bubbling beneath the surface. "I'm certain. This is the Grand Westwood Hotel, right?" he responded, his tone firm but polite. Before the receptionist could reply, a man in a tailored suit approached, the hotel manager, Mr. Collins. His demeanor radiated authority, but there was an unmistakable arrogance in his stride. He glanced at James with a brief, dismissive look before turning his attention to the receptionist. "Is there a problem here?" Collins asked, his voice carrying a practiced politeness that barely concealed his disdain. The receptionist hesitated, unsure how to respond. "This gentleman claims he has a reservation, but I couldn't find it in our system," she explained quietly, casting a sideways glance at James. Collins nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he turned to face James. "I'm afraid we don't have any record of your reservation, sir. Are you certain you've booked a room here?" His tone was condescending, as if speaking to a child who'd wandered into a place they didn't belong. James maintained his composure, though his patience was wearing thin. "Yes, I am certain," he replied. "I can show you the confirmation email if that helps." Collins' lips curled into a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That won't be necessary," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "However, we do have certain standards here, and I must ask you to leave if you don't have a confirmed reservation." The tension in the lobby thickened, and James felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He could sense the judgment in those stares, silent accusations and assumptions based on nothing but his skin color and presence in this upscale establishment. He knew this game all too well. "I have a confirmed reservation," James reiterated, his voice firm but calm. "And I'm here for an important meeting. Please check again." Collins's expression hardened, and he glanced at the security guard standing nearby. "Gentlemen," he called out, his voice taking on a commanding tone, "please escort this man out of the hotel. He's clearly mistaken." The guards moved in, their hands hovering near their radios. James felt his heart rate quicken. He had no intention of causing a scene, but he wasn't going to back down either. He reached into his pocket to retrieve his phone, intending to show his reservation confirmation. But the guards mistook the movement as a threat. "Hands where I can see them," one of the guards barked, his voice echoing through the lobby. A hush fell over the room as guests turned to watch the unfolding drama. James could feel his frustration mounting. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm just getting my phone to show you the email." "Sir, we need you to comply," the other guard insisted, stepping closer. James could see the tension in their stances, the way their hands hovered near their belts, ready to escalate the situation. Collins watched with a smug expression, seemingly relishing the power he wielded in this moment. "If you do not leave voluntarily, we will have to remove you by force," he said, his voice dripping with false civility. James took a deep breath, weighing his options. He knew he could press the issue further, but the situation had already spiraled out of control. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose his composure. "Fine," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I'll leave. But this isn't over." As he turned to walk away, the guards roughly grabbed his arms, pushing him toward the exit. James stumbled slightly, his dignity bruised but intact. He could hear the whispers and snickers of the onlookers, feel the judgmental eyes boring into his back. His business associates, who had been waiting for him, watched in shock and disbelief. Outside, James straightened his jacket, smoothing out the wrinkles left by the guards' rough handling. He took a moment to collect himself, his mind racing with thoughts of how to handle this injustice. He pulled out his phone and saw that his business meeting had already been compromised. His associates were hesitant now, shaken by the spectacle they'd witnessed. But as James stood there, he felt a new sense of resolve harden within him. He glanced back at the grand entrance of the hotel, now tainted by the memory of humiliation and prejudice. This was not going to end here. No, this was just the beginning. News of the incident spread like wildfire across social media. Video footage of James being manhandled by security went viral, with thousands expressing outrage over the blatant racial profiling and discrimination. People began calling for boycotts and demanding accountability. The hotel's reputation took a nosedive. By evening, their social media pages were flooded with negative comments, and news outlets picked up the story, further amplifying the fallout. Behind the scenes, James was already making moves. He had connections and resources that the hotel management hadn't anticipated. The drop in the hotel's stock value was a golden opportunity. He contacted his financial team, and within hours, they began negotiating a purchase. By midnight, the deal was done. James Hall was now the new owner of the Grand Westwood Hotel. As he stood outside, staring at the building that had just yesterday represented a place of shame and indignity, he knew that tomorrow he would return. Not as an unwelcome guest, but as the one holding all the power. James Hall stood outside the Grand Westwood Hotel the next morning, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle over him. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the elegant facade of the hotel. Today, he was not the humiliated guest forcibly removed from the premises. Today, he was the new owner. The events of the previous day had set the stage for what was about to unfold. The outrage over the viral video of his mistreatment had caused the hotel's reputation to plummet overnight. Investors were spooked, and the hotel's stock value nosedived. James saw his chance and seized it. By the time the sun had set, he had bought a controlling interest in the Grand Westwood. Now, he was here to set things right. He adjusted his suit and walked through the revolving glass doors. The lobby was still waking up, and only a few guests were milling around. The familiar faces of the staff, who had treated him with contempt just a day before, were now filled with shock and disbelief. Whispers quickly spread among them as they realized who had just walked in. Without pausing, James made his way to the reception desk. The same young receptionist from yesterday was there, her face paling as she recognized him. She stiffened, her previous arrogance replaced by uncertainty. "Good morning," James said calmly. "I need to speak with your manager, now." The receptionist nodded wordlessly, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the phone and called the back office. A few moments later, Mr. Collins, the manager who had orchestrated James's public humiliation, appeared. His confident demeanor had evaporated overnight. The smug expression from the previous day was replaced by a look of confusion and barely concealed anxiety. "Mr. Hall," Collins began, attempting a polite smile that came off as forced. "What brings you back here today? Is there something we can assist you with?" James smiled, but it wasn't the warm, friendly smile Collins might have hoped for. It was the kind of smile that carried the weight of knowing exactly who was in control. "Yes, actually, there is something you can assist me with," James replied. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and laid it on the reception counter. "These are the documents confirming that I am now the majority owner of the Grand Westwood Hotel." For a moment, the lobby seemed to freeze in time. Collins's eyes widened, and he looked from James to the papers and back again, his face paling by the second. He reached out with a shaking hand to pick up the documents, quickly scanning them. This can't be right," Collins stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," James replied, his voice steady and calm. "I've acquired a majority share. As of now, I'm the one in charge." A heavy silence fell over the lobby as the staff and guests processed what had just been revealed. Collins stood there, stunned and speechless, his mind racing to make sense of the situation. Yesterday, he had been on top, secure in his authority and his assumptions. Today, everything had changed. "Mr. Collins," James continued, his tone firm, "please gather all the staff in the main hall. We're going to have a meeting, a mandatory one." Within minutes, the entire hotel staff was assembled in the grand hall. Nervous whispers filled the room as employees exchanged anxious glances. The air was thick with uncertainty and fear. Some had seen the viral video, others had only heard rumors. But now it was clear that the hotel was under new management. James stood at the front of the room, surveying the crowd. He could see the apprehension on their faces. People who had once held power and privilege were now reduced to uncertainty. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. "Good morning," James began, his voice carrying a calm authority that silenced the room. "For those who don't know, my name is James Hall, and as of last night, I am the new owner of the Grand Westwood Hotel." A murmur rippled through the crowd. James let it settle before continuing. "I'm sure you all saw what happened yesterday, or at least heard about it. What occurred in this hotel was unacceptable. Discrimination, prejudice, and mistreatment of any guest will not be tolerated here. From this moment forward." His words were met with a mixture of shock and apprehension. Some employees nodded, perhaps feeling guilt or shame. Others looked defiant, their jaws set in stubborn resistance. "Effective immediately," James announced, his tone unyielding. "Mr. Collins, you are relieved of your duties as manager. Your conduct yesterday was inexcusable. You may collect your things and leave the premises." Colin's face turned a deep shade of red. He opened his mouth to protest, but one look at James's expression told him it would be pointless. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and there was no longer room for negotiation. He nodded stiffly, and without a word, turned to leave the room, his pride visibly shattered. James continued, "To the rest of the staff, I'm giving you an opportunity. We are going to rebuild this hotel from the ground up. I'm instituting a mandatory training program on cultural sensitivity, equality, and respect for every employee, from the top down. This isn't optional." Several hands shot up, but James held up a hand to stop them. "I know some of you may not agree with this, and that's fine. You're free to leave if you cannot adhere to these new principles. But for those who choose to stay, understand that this is not just about keeping your job. It's about becoming better, about learning from the mistakes of the past." A few employees exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear that some were struggling to come to terms with the new reality. They had operated under a certain mindset for years, one where they were untouchable. Now they were faced with a choice: adapt or leave. As the meeting concluded, James watched the crowd disperse. He could sense the undercurrent of discontent among some of the employees. He wasn't naive. He knew that changing a deeply ingrained culture wouldn't happen overnight. There would be resistance, perhaps even sabotage, but he was prepared. Later that day, James walked through the halls of the hotel, observing the staff as they went about their duties. He could hear the whispers, see the suspicious glances cast his way. Some of the older staff members, those who had been there for years and were used to running things their way, were the most resistant. They murmured amongst themselves, making vague plans to undermine the new rules. As the meeting concluded, James watched the crowd disperse. He could sense the undercurrent of discontent among some of the employees. He wasn't naive. He knew that changing a deeply ingrained culture wouldn't happen overnight. There would be resistance, perhaps even sabotage. But he was prepared. Later that day, James walked through the halls of the hotel, observing the staff as they went about their duties. He could hear the whispers, see the suspicious glances cast his way. Some of the older staff members, those who had been there for years and were used to running things their way, were the most resistant. They murmured amongst themselves, making vague plans to undermine the new rules. "I hear some of you aren't happy with the changes," James said, catching a small group of staff off guard. They quickly straightened up, forcing fake smiles. "Let me be clear. I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to make this a better place, for our guests and for you. But if you think that you can continue with your old ways, you'll find that you're sorely mistaken." The employees shifted uncomfortably, not daring to meet his gaze. James nodded, satisfied that his point had been made. He was setting the tone early. There would be no tolerance for insubordination or sabotage. Behind closed doors, however, the rumblings of discontent continued. A few staff members, led by a former senior manager who had been demoted to a lower position, began to quietly plot ways to resist the changes. They whispered about making James's efforts fail, spreading rumors among the employees to sow discord. James was not unaware of these developments. He had anticipated them. He had already begun hiring new staff members, particularly those who had experienced discrimination and were eager for a fair chance. He knew these new hires would be crucial in setting an example and balancing the scales. As the days passed, the tension in the hotel grew. Employees who had once felt secure in their positions now felt vulnerable. Some were willing to adapt, to learn, and to grow in this new environment. Others clung stubbornly to their old habits and prejudices, their resentment simmering just beneath the surface. James observed it all with a calm, determined gaze. This was a test, for him and for them. Would they rise to the challenge, or would they crumble under the weight of their own arrogance? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. The Grand Westwood Hotel would never be the same again. The days following James Hall's takeover of the Grand Westwood Hotel were tense and transformative. Change was in the air, and everyone could feel it. The grand lobby, once filled with self-assured managers and staff who prided themselves on their status, now buzzed with uncertainty. James's new rules had shaken the very foundation on which this hotel had been built, and the cracks were starting to show. The mandatory cultural sensitivity and equality training sessions began almost immediately. Former senior managers and supervisors, many of whom had long believed themselves to be above reproach, now found themselves sitting shoulder to shoulder with junior staff in cramped meeting rooms. For the first time, they were forced to confront their biases, face uncomfortable truths about their past behavior, and listen to the perspectives of those they had often dismissed or overlooked. James made it clear from the start that the training was not merely a formality. Every employee was expected to participate fully, and everyone, no matter their title or seniority, was now being evaluated on their willingness to adapt and learn. Resistance to these new norms would not be tolerated. In the days that followed, a significant change in the hotel's staffing structure was implemented. Many of those who had previously occupied leadership roles were reassigned to entry-level positions. The former assistant manager, once proud and commanding, now found herself working as a server in the hotel's restaurant, a job she had once looked down upon. She was now serving guests alongside the very people she had previously ignored or scorned. The changes were most striking in the behavior of Mr. Collins, the former manager. Stripped of his authority, Collins was reassigned as a concierge. This new role forced him to interact directly with guests, attend to their needs, and, most importantly, practice the kind of humility and customer service he had rarely displayed in his previous position. James watched him closely, noting the subtle shifts in his demeanor, from the stiff reluctance of a man unused to being told what to do, to the gradual resignation of someone who had no other choice. The former kitchen supervisor, a man named Brian, who had once commanded the kitchen staff with an iron fist, was now on the cleaning crew. He scrubbed floors and washed dishes, his hands raw from the work he had once assigned to others. James saw him one day, muttering to himself as he mopped the lobby floor, his once confident face now twisted with bitterness and frustration. Meanwhile, James brought in new employees, particularly individuals from marginalized community, who had faced discrimination in their previous jobs. These new hires were given opportunities to lead, manage, and contribute ideas to the hotel's transformation. One of them, a young black woman named Aisha, was promoted to head the guest relations team. She had previously been a front desk clerk in another hotel, but had been denied promotion repeatedly, despite her qualifications. Now, she was tasked with setting a new standard for service and inclusivity at the Grand Westwood. The old guard, the former managers and supervisors, found it difficult to adjust to the new power dynamics. They struggled with their diminished roles and the shift in authority. For some, the resentment only grew. For others, however, the experience began to spark introspection. Slowly but surely, they started to see their old attitudes and behaviors in a new light. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere in the hotel began to change. The initial hostility and resistance started to give way to a quiet, uneasy acceptance. James was present every day, walking the floors, talking to the staff, and keeping a close eye on the dynamics. He knew that real change wouldn't come overnight. It was a slow, deliberate process that required both patience and persistence. During one of the training sessions, an interesting conversation unfolded. A former front desk supervisor, Linda, who had been demoted to a bellhop, spoke up. She had been resistant at first, but something had shifted in her. "I've been thinking," Linda said hesitantly, addressing the group. "I never realized how much I was judging people based on appearances. I mean, I thought I was being professional, but maybe I was just being unfair." Aisha, now head of guest relations, nodded and replied, "It's not just about being polite. It's about recognizing that everyone deserves respect and dignity, regardless of how they look or where they come from." Linda looked down, processing the words. "I guess I have a lot to learn," she admitted. Moments like this gave James hope. He could see the potential for growth in some of the staff, but there were others who remained hardened, refusing to let go of their old prejudices. James knew these were the ones who would eventually have to leave, either by choice or by force. The former employees who had been most resistant, like Brian and a few others, began to plot behind closed doors. They whispered about bringing James down, filing complaints, or even staging a walkout. James was aware of these murmurs. He had anticipated this from the start and was prepared. He called a private meeting with these disgruntled employees. "I know some of you are unhappy with the changes," he began. "You feel like you've been demoted or disrespected, but ask yourselves, why do you feel that way? Is it because you've been treated unfairly? Or is it because you're finally being treated equally?" Brian, unable to contain his frustration, blurted out, "This isn't what we signed up for. You can't just come in here and turn everything upside down." James's eyes met his, calm but firm. "Actually, I can. And I did. Because what this place was built on wasn't right. I'm offering you a chance to be part of something better. But that's up to you. You can choose to grow, or you can choose to go." The room fell silent. It was clear that James was not going to back down. He had no interest in compromising with those who were unwilling to change. As the days turned into weeks and then into months, the Grand Westwood Hotel underwent a profound transformation. The once rigid hierarchy began to crumble, replaced by a more inclusive and dynamic structure. The new employees, especially those who had faced discrimination elsewhere, flourished in their roles. Their fresh ideas and enthusiasm breathed new life into the hotel. Guests began to notice the difference. The energy in the hotel was different, more welcoming, more authentic. People started talking about the Grand Westwood as a symbol of change and progress. Positive reviews began to surface online, commending the hotel's newfound commitment to diversity and equality. The turning point came when Mr. Collins, the former manager, now working as a concierge, had a chance encounter with a black family in the lobby. It was a situation that mirrored the incident with James, but the roles were reversed. Collins' face turned pale as he recognized the gravity of the moment. He hesitated, his hands trembling as he handed the family their room keys. His voice shook as he spoke. "Welcome to the Grand Westwood. If there's anything you need, please let me know." The family smiled and thanked him. For the first time, Collins saw himself through their eyes, saw the fear and uncertainty that he had once inflicted on others. He understood in that moment the full weight of what James had been trying to teach them all. It wasn't just about equality in words. It was about experiencing it in action. That evening, Collins approached James, his posture no longer stiff with pride, but rather humble. "I think I'm starting to get it," he said quietly. "I never realized how much I took for granted, how much I looked down on people. I'm sorry." James nodded, sensing the sincerity in Collins' voice. "It's not easy to change," he replied, "but recognizing it is the first step. If you're willing to learn, you have a place here." One by one, other staff members began to follow suit. The resistance gave way to understanding, and the hotel slowly but surely began to thrive under its new leadership. Those who couldn't adapt left, and those who stayed became advocates for the new vision. By the end of the third month, the Grand Westwood Hotel was no longer just a place of luxury. It was a place of learning, growth, and redemption. The transformation was not just in its policies, but in its people. James stood in his office, looking out over the bustling city below. The journey had been long and challenging, but he knew it was only the beginning. He had set out not to seek revenge, but to build something better. And as he watched the hotel come to life in ways he had only dreamed of, he knew he had succeeded. The old system had crumbled, but from its ashes, a new order had taken shape, one built on respect, equality, and justice. And in this new order, there was no room for prejudice. The Grand Westwood Hotel had found its new chapter, and so had everyone within its walls.